Well, again, thank you all for coming today and showing up and attending what's now kind of the fourth or fifth SGMA talk in a row for some of you. I was actually struggling a little bit to try and figure out something new and interesting to say after there was this really fantastic plenary session and then Trevor's talk. So how do I kind of follow up all of that? And I might go a little bit into the weeds and into some of the specific details that the State Water Board specifically is going to be involved with. And I'll talk about why we're involved and how we get there in a little bit. But before we go on, you can kind of see this a little bit. It's a little bit blurry, I'll explain it. This shows the cumulative water storage in the state of California. So this is all of our surface reservoirs. You can see this says Shasta Dam, this is Trinity Dam, and then a bunch of other ones up here. Cumulatively, if you added up all the potential storage in those surface water supplies, there's about 50 million acre feet of storage potential in the state of California. Now let's compare that to groundwater. So here's that 50 million acre feet. This is the kind of range of potential groundwater availability in the state of California. So anywhere from 850 to about 1.3 billion acre feet of groundwater available in the state. There is a study that was released yesterday out of Stanford that suggested that there's maybe 3 times that much available in California's groundwater basins. I think it used the unfortunate heading in the news blurb I saw was a water windfall in California. Well, probably not quite a water windfall. We don't really know what the quality is. We don't really know how accessible it is, and some of it's maybe down 3,000 or 4,000 feet. So when you start thinking about the cost to pump that out, maybe it's not quite as available as it might be, but it's there. So there's a lot of water in California's groundwater basins. So roughly it's anywhere from 10 to 30 times our surface storage. Why is that important? Because about 85% of Californians depend in some context for groundwater for their drinking water supply, and there's a huge agricultural reliance on groundwater as well. So that 85% of Californians here, this is urban water suppliers or public water systems that have at least one groundwater supply well in their system. And it includes places that maybe are 95% reliant on surface water, but they have that one well just in case things go bad. It also includes a tremendous number of domestic well users. And we don't really know how many domestic well users there are in the state of California because we don't really track it. There's the requirements that if you drill a new well, you have to submit a well completion report to the Department of Water Resources, but this isn't in a searchable database. It comes in as a paper copy. There is now an online submittal tool, but it's not mandatory, so we don't really know. Anywhere from about 600,000 to maybe 2 or 3 million people rely on private domestic wells, and that's a tremendous reliance. In addition, there's at least 5 million acres of farmland in California that are irrigated with groundwater more in drought years, and it was that last tagline, more in drought years, that I wanted to show a couple of slides on. It seems like it's a requisite to talk about the California drought. And as Gordon said earlier, SGMA exists kind of outside of the California drought. It's intended to be a longer-term perspective to really address a long-term problem, but at the same time, SGMA would not have happened if it wasn't for the drought. It was the driver of this really catastrophic drought that, the lowest amount of rainfall in what maybe 500 years, lowest snowpack in 500 to maybe 1,200 years, and then there's some more statistics that are coming out that really showed how phenomenally unusual 2015 actually was. But this shows, this is Half Dome, so Yosemite. This was a photo taken the last week of March for 5 years in a row, 2011. That's actually kind of an average year, so you can see a tremendous amount of snow. And then just through time, the last weekend in March, 5 years in a row. So that by 2015, there really was no snowpack in California for what was probably the first time in a long, long time. So that was the last 5 years, and we've kind of talked about the drought in the context of a 5-year drought. But if you look at, this is maybe a little bit hard to read, this is delta outflow. And this is discharge on this axis, and then this is year through here. So the last 5 years go back, kind of this peak right here, and then through here. 2014 was actually a drier year than 2015, but because 2015 was warmer, the precipitation that fell as rain, and we had no snowpack. So you can see we had a little spike here, but if you look back in time, the preceding 5 years before that were actually really, really dry too. So, we've in California, we talk about the context of the Australian experience and whether or not California might experience a millennial type drought, 10 or 12 years, depending on how you measure it. There's the suggestion, this was looking at delta outflow, so how much water is actually being discharged from the Sacramento River, the San Joaquin River, so that 75 or 66% of all discharge that Trevor showed in his map earlier. And it's really low all through here. And if you go back before about 2007, you can see it's kind of just uniformly higher. So there is already kind of the suggestion that California's been in this extended dry period for a long time. And the question is, what do we do about it? How do we change things, and how do we respond to this kind of perhaps paradigm shift coupled with additional climate change drivers that may result in kind of a permanent state that's something more like this as opposed to something more like this. And you can't really compare 10 years to the entire climatic record, but it's kind of illustrative of what we might need to start thinking about. So in the context of that drought, the legislature and the governor, with really the governor's leadership, was able to kind of move forward on SGMA and pass this really groundbreaking groundwater legislation that for the first time requires this comprehensive management of groundwater resources at the local level. And you've seen this slide a bunch of times. The red and orange are the SGMA basins, those 127 basins. We've kind of already touched on this a little bit, requires the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. Those GSAs are then required to develop a sustainability plan with about 3 to 5 years. And it creates this state backstop. And it's in the context of the state backstop that I want to talk about or spend the rest of the time talking about. So what are the state backstop? Well, what the state backstop is the recognition that while groundwater is best managed at the local level, if there isn't the kind of will or the way to do it at the local level, then there needs to be some sort of state element that steps in and actually manages that groundwater until the locals are able to do that on their own. That groundwater was such an important resource that we can't just leave it to kind of an open-ended, maybe we'll get to it, maybe someday we'll find the political way to get there and manage it on our own, that the state needed to provide a credible kind of threat in some sense. There are 2 state backstop agencies. We usually talk about the State Water Board as the primary state backstop, but DWR is also involved because while they're providing technical assistance and they're developing regulations, they also review the plans. And so when these GSAs develop their sustainability plans, they're going to turn them into the Department of Water Resources. And the first real kind of state backstop role is the review and evaluation of those sustainability plans. And when DWR, in consultation with the board, finds that those plans are inadequate or that they're not being implemented correctly, it gets kicked over into kind of this second level of state intervention. And that's really primarily at the State Water Resources Control Board. The important element about the State Water Board intervention is that we only intervene when local efforts do not succeed. So there's no context in which we can just decide to step in on our own. It's really driven by something that doesn't happen at the local level. We kind of do 2 things. We, at first, are data managers, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides, where people start reporting stuff directly to the State Water Board. Then we use the information that comes in as data managers to decide whether or not we need to take further or subsequent management efforts in the basin, at which point we actually become basin managers. So we're directly stepping in and directly regulating and managing groundwater resources at the local level. These are the kind of triggers that can result in State Water Board intervention. And there's a bunch of them, and I'll kind of walk through them slowly. I think it's worth kind of spending a little bit of time talking about what they actually are. So the first one is actually coming up in about a year, almost a year to the day, a year and 2 days. And that's for areas without a groundwater sustainability agency. Those areas have to begin directly reporting data to the State Water Resources Control Board. And that data includes the location of your well, how much you're pumping, what you're growing with that water that you're pumping, or what you're doing with it. Doesn't necessarily have to be growing, but predominantly it will be agricultural regions. It could be industry, it could be municipal wells as well. And the point of use. So where you're either applying that water for use or where you're serving it in your district or whatever you're doing with it. The next intervention trigger is January 31st, 2020. So let's assume that you form your GSA, you kind of get the state board out of your hair for a while. I do want to note here that this trigger doesn't involve the Department of Water Resources referring a basin to us. So in this element, when you don't form a GSA, we don't need the department to refer you to us. We can directly step in. January 31st, 2020, this is for basins that are in critical conditions of overdraft. That's the deadline for submitting your sustainability plan. So if you don't submit your sustainability plan, the state board can directly step in. It also then triggers this Department of Water Resources evaluation where they can start looking at your plan and they can then refer it to us for subsequent work. This is true also for the rest of those non-overdrafted basins in 2022. And then lastly, in 2025, we have this additional kind of trigger, which states that probationary basin designation can begin where a plan is inadequate, so that's a finding by the Department of Water Resources. They've referred it to us, and then the board makes an additional finding that there are significant depletions of interconnected surface water. But again, the important kind of takeaway is that in all triggering events, intervention is the result of failure by locals to create a sustainability agency or to adopt and implement the plan. So what happens when we do get triggered? What happens when the state board actually does start stepping in? Kind of three things, and I've lumped two of them together up top. Fees and data. We're going to start charging people a fee, and we're going to charge that fee so that they can report data to us so that we can manage the data for them and that we can then report that data out and use it to make kind of qualitative assessments about the condition of the basin. If we need to, we can then take a further step and start developing interim management plans. And these are called interim management plans specifically in the SGMA statute. The intention is that the board's never really a permanent caretaker. We want to step in, we'll manage things for a little while, but then we want to turn it back over to the locals when kind of things have gotten up to speed and when there are suitable kind of governance and management potential in the basin. Here's what our fees look like. This is kind of a busy slide. I'll step through it a little bit. We're going to have two types of fees. The first is going to be really just a simple reporting fee. And that's that kind of element that I talked about earlier, where your well is located, what you're pumping, and where you're applying the water and what you're using it for. And there's a couple of other things there, but it's very specifically spelled out in statute. There's 8 elements. That's what we can ask for. That's what we're going to collect, and that's what we're going to charge a fee for. It gets a little more difficult if we need to take that next step and kind of decide that we need to manage the basin directly. And to do that, we have to put the basin under what's called a probationary status. When we put a basin under probationary status, it kind of opens up our fee authority. So not only can we charge for the reporting, but we can then start wrapping up or recovering costs associated with facilitation. Maybe there's people that, we want to bring people together. They just haven't sat down to try and work things out. Maybe we need to go in and install a monitoring network. Maybe we need to develop a new groundwater model. These are all cost recoverable elements that we can directly charge back to the basin. But one of the questions that we kind of have in kind of moving this forward is how do we do that? And we're kind of in the very early stages of putting together what we think is a fee framework. We're hoping that we're going to have some stakeholder outreach process probably in August and September of this year, where we're hoping to have targeted kind of meetings and say, this is our proposed framework. What do people think? Do you have any comments? It's a little bit of a weird fee assessment as well. I've said this in other presentations, but if things go exactly like they need to go, then the board has no fees. So it's not like a water rights fee where if you're using the right, you have to report to the board and it's kind of this whole management program. But if you're doing what you need to do, then the board has no role for intervention and we have no way to actually step in and assess that fee. So we'll start this process probably pretty soon. And then we're hoping to take it to the board by kind of spring 2017 for adoption as an emergency regulation so that they're in place and ready, excuse me, by next June, less than a year. We're also kind of thinking about how does that apply in an equability sense. Is that a word? I might have made that word up. How equitable is the fee? And this is a slide that shows acres per farm, so 1 to 9, 10 to 49, number of farms in the state of California, percent of all California farms, and then it's really this column that I think is particularly interesting. What it shows is that the vast number of farms, so about 60 or so percent of all farms in California are less than 50 acres in size. And that of those 60% of the farms, they cumulatively account for about 4% of the irrigated acreage in all of California. Conversely, farms that are 5,000 acres or more in size, or about 1% of the total numbers, account for about a quarter of all the irrigated agriculture. So whatever fee we come up with, it needs to be kind of relevant not only to the number of farms in California, because we can't just excuse vast numbers of farms in total from this kind of program, but it also needs to be conscious of the fact that a lot of the irrigated agriculture, and hence a lot of the groundwater use, is actually being driven by these really large farms that are covering big swaths of the state. What else are we going to do? So we collect this data, we start charging fees. We eventually take that data in and we decide if we need to become a basin manager. So we develop fees to support the basin management. We put the basin under this probationary status. The probationary status leads to the development of these interim plans, and we use that interim plan to manage the basin until local efforts come up to speed. We have a couple of other kind of, not to shift topics rapidly, but when we do this probationary basin designation and we look at these interim management plans, I wanted to talk about two kind of potentially challenging elements in doing so. And one is water quality, and this was something that was brought up in some of the plenary discussions earlier today. There's a lot of water quality elements already going on in the state. There's the egg coalitions, there's the salt nutrient management plans, and now SGMA needs to incorporate some of this into avoiding the degradation of water quality as one of their undesirable results. I think that the state and regional boards can serve as not necessarily the point person, but we need to figure out how we can share data that we have, either through our GeoTracker system, our GAMMA system, or through the waste discharge requirements and other things that we already collect, how we can share that information with the GSAs as they start to develop. The other element is really this interconnected surface water, and this is undesirable result number 6, which says that one of the undesirable results is the depletion of interconnected surface waters that have significant and unreasonable adverse impacts on beneficial uses of surface water. So one of the major questions that we see going forward is, how do you do that? And so this is probably a slide that many of you are familiar with, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it just because of time. This is from the USGS circular, showing the different kind of effects that a well could have on a surface water system. You have a gaining stream, you have a losing stream, a disconnected, and then a fully depleted stream. And if you put a well here or here and you start sucking water from near the edge of a stream, then you really can deplete the flow in that surface water. And it was kind of illustrative over the last drought when some of the water rights folks were out doing curtailment inspections, how many places that had a curtailed surface water right, when the inspector went out and was talking to the landowner and asked, well, how are they getting by without their surface water right? The landowner would walk out to the levee protecting the river and point to the well that was about 30 feet off the side of the river and said, oh, I'm fine, I just pump groundwater. Well, that's not really groundwater at that point. You're just pulling directly from the surface water. And so one of the major challenges for the GSAs is setting a threshold for interconnected surface water. How are they going to be able to do that? They're going to need estimates of depletion to set relevant thresholds. So right now, I think in all of California, there's not many places that really know how much depletion is occurring. And so if you're going to do that, one of the first things I think that you're going to need to do, and this is going to be a judgment call for each one of the GSAs going forward on how they do this, but I would suggest that you can't set a threshold for what you can't measure. You're going to have to figure out how much depletion is going on, whether you do that through a numerical model, an analytical model, some sort of approach that goes out, identifies the wells, and looks at how much depletion is being caused or contributed to by pumping from those wells. And without doing that, there's no real way that you can come up with a coherent threshold. I think people will try, and people might get close in some areas relative to others, but you really need an accounting method to go forward. So just to kind of finish up, what does SGMA mean for agriculture? I think better data is one of the main things that's going to come out of SGMA. They're going to have greater efficiency, and that efficiency and just kind of general water use in general is going to tie into nutrient loading and how how nitrogen and other kind of nutrients and fertilizers are applied at the statewide level. I think in general, water will become more expensive, whether it's surface water, because now there's going to be markets that develop and that kind of tradable surface water right is going to become much more valuable to others that don't have a secure right. I think groundwater is going to become more expensive as well, simply because with the development of the GSAs and kind of the administrative costs and then maybe project costs that come online, there's probably going to be some sort of volumetric fee, whether it's at state level or the local level, and that's going to make water in general more expensive. There may be less in some places, and this is one of the questions that was asked at the plenary session, that there's this estimate of 1 million or some acres that would go out of production. We don't really know if that's true. It's really kind of premature to guess at that. But if you look at some GSAs that don't have surface water and that are severely overdrafting their groundwater basins, it's really hard to figure out how they're going to kind of balance that groundwater basin without some sort of demand reduction, whether or not that's across the board or focused or through retirement of agricultural land. That's up to the locals to decide, but it's highly likely in some places that that will occur. And then locals finally will need to reconcile land use changes. A lot of, not a lot, but there are many places in California where, through demand hardening, transition from crops that you could fallow from year to year when there was a drought to permanent orchards or the types of crops that you have to water year after year, whether or not there's a drought or whether there's water or not, has driven some of the groundwater oversupply issues in the basins. And the locals, those who are in charge of land use decisions, are going to need to face that and figure out how they want to manage their own local land use so that it contemplates and integrates with SGMA going forward. And with that, I'll stop, and I think we have time for questions.